Hello and welcome to the CIDDL Research and Practice Brief. The purpose of this series is to have conversations around innovative uses of technology, universal design, in special education, early childhood, related service providers, leadership personnel preparation programs, and the like. Today, we're joined by Dr. Michael Ralph, who studies teaching and learning in context and recognizes the importance of understanding people, instruction, and environment. He's published on issues of educational practice and measurement, and his research leverages mixed methods and interdisciplinary collaborations to bring a novel perspective to educational programs. As the director of research for Multi-Studio, he provides design input and plans evaluation studies to improve the accessibility and inclusivity of educational environments. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So as we're talking about universal design, before we jump into it, can you give us a brief overview of universal design and how that's different from universal design for learning and how they're related?
In my background, I work at a design firm, but I'm an educator by training and by practice. And so I taught in high school and in college, like at the high school and university levels. And I say all that as a preface to say that then, since I am not an architect, you should take all of this as the understanding of an educator who works with lots of people who think about universal design, which is an architectural framework thinking about proactively creating environments and architecture and design spaces to provide lots of options for different people to move through those spaces in the ways that make sense for them. It's thinking about, the very famous example is curb cutouts, which are something that increases the accessibility of moving between sidewalks and roads and back onto sidewalks. And those are great, but then what we have learned since we started implementing curb cutouts is that they're great for lots of people in lots of different contexts. I ride a skateboard. I love having the cutouts to be able to go up and down on sidewalks, which is one of many examples of people who have benefited from that more accessible design strategy. And so universal design thinks about how can we have similar approaches to other architectural questions, designing, planning questions. And so I think for the way that I think about universal design for learning is specifically focusing in that same sort of philosophy of creating a flexible structure within the context of academic outcomes, academic goals, and at the academic and broadest definition of that term. So that includes social emotional development. That includes being creative in the context of doing projects or pursuing passions. And so what are ways that we can create educational structures defined very broadly? How can we create classrooms? How can we create lesson designs? How can we create interaction procedures? How can we create all of these things in a way that allow for lots of people to move through them and find success in them and define success in them in lots of different ways?
Cool. So more specifically, what issues are you trying to address through your work with universal design?
So something that Multi-Studio has worked on for a little while now, in collaboration with UDL researchers across the world, is thinking about what are the implications of universal design for learning reapplied back into architecture and interior design. And so if we think about accessibility in an architectural lens, it very often is not considering things like how do we learn better. It's thinking about the mechanics of being able to move through the environment. And so one of the things that we work on is how can we design educational spaces with the same flexible philosophy, but in providing access to lots of different instructional strategies, lots of different educational experiences. And what does the architectural environment, what does the designed environment need to do to both support those kinds of choices, but then also to maybe prompt or to facilitate, to make more salient some of those kinds of decisions as the teachers and learners are working in those spaces. So the kinds of things we might ask is what kinds of classroom designs allow teachers who have experience or are inclined to be applying UDL, how do we help them be more responsive and more flexible in the environments and what they're actually doing with the students?
Can you walk us through how you have those conversations? Because obviously the pedagogy and the academic kind of side of things versus how you set up the space, how do you explore that with a teacher? Like, how do you sit down and have that conversation to figure out what's the best way to to create a space that is flexible when some of us may not know what our options are.
Yeah, and you kind of hit the nail on the head in your question of really working closely and being in community with educators is a big piece of what we do. You know, multi-studio as an identity, like one of our core values is really bringing together teams to think about questions, lots of different people with lots of different areas of expertise. And so from the design side, you know, I coming from a teacher background, that has some value, but that's not the same thing as actually working in the school context where these projects are happening. And so being in collaboration with the teachers, with students themselves, with community members, with administration, with lots of different people who have something to say and something to add, and how these environments are working is an important piece of it. You know, we authored along with some other UDL researchers, some of whom you know, we authored the UDL deck of spaces, which is a series of card decks that is intended to facilitate some of those conversations. So it brings in some of the recent research that's supporting how UDL can have an impact for teachers or learners, and does it in a way that we really strove to make that accessible to people who don't have a design background or don't have formal training in education, for example, so that a parent or maybe a 12-year-old student can be flipping through these decks, and they're very visual. They have accessible. They have text written for a layperson to be able to see. Oh, that resonates with me, and maybe I only have any familiarity with the classrooms as they have existed in the past. But seeing this imagery and helps me think about lots of other ways that our systems can be, lots of other ways that our spaces can be, which really gets me excited about this particular idea, and helping them articulate what is really most appealing to them in the future that they want to build helps us then put architecture around it in a way that that can then help them reach that.
The deck of spaces sounds super cool. Do you happen to have one handy?
Do I have one? I do.
Can you show us and walk us through what it would look like and how you might use it, either in a classroom kind of school setting where you're discussing design, or how higher ed faculty might use it in their preparation programs as they're talking about UDL and flexibility and environments with their pre-service?
I do. It's not at my desk. Give me 1 second. I'll grab one off the shelf. So I got up and I actually grabbed one of both our K-12 deck of spaces and then one that's focused specifically on higher education. And what you'll notice as you look through the cards is I mentioned very visual cards. So on one side, we've got lots of imagery that we put together that are examples of different kinds of spaces that might exemplify whatever that particular card is talking about. And then on the other side, it's got text that elaborates, and you're not going to be able to see it on the camera, but the individual text, what was really important to us was that we weren't trying to suggest that we were going to have the singular answer to any particular component of what might be important in space design. And so instead of saying your classroom should look like this, which is silly, we got like discussion prompts and questions, things that might say, have you considered how the role of making? Have you considered the role of your library in interfacing with classrooms? So these sorts of discussion prompts, the goal is that the answer is not on the cards, but the questions might help lead a conversation between teachers, between parents, between students toward an answer that could resonate and could be very different from one conversation to the next. And so the K-12 deck is really tailored for like K-12 type schools, and that's all school settings. And then the higher education deck is a little bit different in tone and is more focused on the higher education context, but is still the same overall format of visual imagery and text to support it. So an educator working in any of those contexts, we've seen them get used in a lot of different ways, from engaging on architecture projects. And we're talking about a new school. These are a great way to talk about what you want to see in that school. But it's also has been really useful even in like professional development settings or working like at a department meeting, to be able to think a little bit more creatively about how you might use what's already in your space, or how you might make much smaller scale changes to set up your space in a way that is more proactive and supportive for the different learners whom you might be working with. And especially in some contexts, helping schools think as their student body is changing, perhaps from how it used to be in years past. So thinking about if they're serving a new group of students, how they could reorient their facility and their environments to support students students moving into the future.
Cool. And you created those were created in collaboration with RPI, Dr. James Basham, if I am correct.
Yep, they were if you get him and our lead over here, David Reed, together, and they will tell you all about the story of thinking about the importance of architecture and space design at the very beginning, and thinking through how to make those connections, but also make those connections in a compelling way that's accessible to everybody who might have something to say about education design.
So while we're on that topic, what implications do you see for the future of research in universal design? What are some questions we might be asking as we're preparing both for future service providers and educators and like the student of the future? What might we be asking? What might we be doing?
Oh my goodness, we have just so many questions going on right now about the different impacts. And one of the things that is so compelling to me about universal design is really the flexibility with which it can have an impact. And so it can mean lots of different things to lots of different teachers and have lots of different impacts to lots of different students. And while that I think is really, really exciting from a practitioner standpoint, it also can be challenging from a research standpoint to be able to put things together in a way that can really directly link evidence to the claims and to the discussions that we're wanting to have. And so one of the things that I think a lot about is how we can be strategic in identifying very specific sources of data and using them to answer very specific questions about how they're helping and who they're providing help for. And so I think rather than trying to make any like very broad, very normative, very limiting statements about all students are this or should be this or benefit in this particular way, which is in direct conflict with I think the philosophy of UDL in the first place. It's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of work from a lot of people to identify how students with a very particular disability might have a very particular lived experience in a classroom, and what can this particular implementation of the UDL framework be able to improve their experience and be able to allow them a greater opportunity for success as they define it, which in this context might be graduation rates, or this context might be the way that they view success in STEM learning or whatever it might be. But I think narrowing down and operationalizing those questions to be very human centric rather than broadly trying to paint a picture across lots and lots of different users is something that it's going to take a lot of work, but I think it's important to be able to then reframe research again through that fundamental UDL philosophy.
Cool. Are there any specific technologies or resources you would suggest? Obviously, the deck of spaces. But if someone wanted to get more involved in learning more about the flexibility and in universal design, where would you suggest they go, or what would they look for?
There's a lot of really exciting work going on right now about thinking about applying UDL to learning environments. We've got the Deca Spaces. We just put out the second edition, a revised edition of the K-12 Deca Spaces. That was that I got to be involved in, really trying to put a more explicit lens on how UDL can have implications for considerations of equity and inclusion across a variety of axes of identity. And so we're really, really proud of that work. But also, if you're interested in more of the research around the impacts of UDL, I'd recommend, I know, Dr. Basham has a paper that came out not too long ago that he did in collaboration with some of our folks around here, looking at different learning spaces across a variety of contexts, all the way from elementary up to higher education learners, and got a lot of really useful feedback from students about what were the things that were working and what were the things that they'd like to see be different. And I think some of that research is going to be really useful for anybody who's considering making changes big or small in their spaces. So check out some of that research as you're thinking about what you might do in your particular classroom.
Very good. Okay, last question. Can you tell us about your favorite space you designed, or some like a visual, kind of paint a picture for us of what does this universal design in schools look like with flexibility? What are all the pieces?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so what is my favorite space, or what is an ideal space? Because they're different, right? Every space is imperfect. But I think when I was still working in the high school classroom, I got a grant to build a makerspace in my school. And the particular space that we were going to rework was a closet, but it was a closet that had originally been designed as a physics lab. And if that sounds like quite a mix of spaces, you're right. That was an unusual thing. I still
Sounds like a
remember.
large closet.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so, and I remember when I was looking around for where to put our makerspace and getting halfway into like the storage and stacked boxes, and I find some drop power midway in. And I'm like, wait, what is this doing in here? This is amazing. This would be really useful. And so, what we did is we remade that room, trying to think about how we could make a makerspace that can do lots of different things for lots of different students. You know, it wasn't targeting any specific program. It was really supposed to be for the general, like for everybody in the school, all 2,000 students that we served. And so finding a way to be able to make tools and equipment accessible, organized, because structure is important for people to be able to have agency in the spaces that they're working, but also freedom to put things together in the way that makes sense. And so we had some pretty large work surfaces that could be moved whenever they needed to have the floor space, but also were large enough that you don't have to move them. You can just claim a little bit of that space for your individual project, and a lot of visible open storage. And so we had the students created a lot of the organization and a lot of the labeling, but also a lot of that we didn't have any doors on any of our cabinets. It was all open and visible shelving, so that they, as you're looking around and trying to be creative, you can very quickly scan the room and see which things you want to be using, and you can do all that without having to touch base with me as the facilitator. And so I really loved that space that we were able to put together, because it did both of those things, being very organized and intentional, something that I was able to do. Really, the students put together most of the organization, but then also being flexible enough that we could remake that space. I mean, in 10 minutes, we could completely recreate what we were doing in there to accommodate a project that's very large, or a project that needs some heavy equipment, or whatever it needed. All that structure didn't stand in the way of our creativity.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing about universal design with us. And we look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks.